Hello, everyone. We're currently live. We're streaming on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter through Periscope. Twitter is a little down today, not helping us that much, but we're hoping that more people join us as they get this live alert. Here we're speaking through the Global Ecosocialist Network. We run these events about every couple of months to bring awareness to issues of global attention, of global necessity. And today our topic is very, very important. We're still in the midst of the pandemic. Last year, we would think that by 2021, things would be getting better, but in a lot of places, it's actually getting worse. And vaccination is part of this conversation. So we are running this event discussing the dangers of vaccine nationalism and the plight for a people's vaccine. We're very happy to have here with us today Vijay Prashad and Fatima Hassan. I'm also here with Rihad Desai, another member from the Global Ecosocialist Network, and he's speaking from South Africa. I'm the Brazilian part of the show today, and I'm going to introduce our speakers to you before I hand it over to them because you're here to listen to them, not me. And we're here with Vijay Prashad. Vijay is a historian, a journalist, commentator, author of many books, Marxist intellectual. He's an executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the chief editor of Leftward Books. Fatima Hassan is a South African social justice activist and human rights lawyer. She worked on HIV with the AIDS law project, former Minister of Health and Public.
Sabrina is in and out, right? Well, out now.
Hello.
Frozen.
You're
Hi.
back. Welcome back.
Yeah? Okay. Did you listen to me for a second?
Well, you were halfway through Fatima's introduction.
Did I get cut
you
out?
Want to start
I got
that
cut
again.
out. I'm saying we're having we're running into a problem of boycotting and sabotaging today. Was that introducing? Did you hear me introducing Fatima?
You were halfway through that introduction, so you might want to just repeat it. Yeah.
I'm going to repeat that. I'm so sorry, everyone. So Fatima is a South African social justice activist and human rights lawyer. She worked on HIV/AIDS medicine access advocacy with the AIDS Law Project, served as special advisor to South Africa's former Minister of Health and Public Enterprises, and is the founder of the Health Justice Initiative. That's it. Throughout our live stream, I'm also going to make available a few links coming from Vijay and from Fatima on the issue, so you can also get acquainted to some of their writing and also keep up with them on their social media where they're always posting about these things. Don't forget to also, if you're not following us already on Twitter, on Facebook, and subscribe here on YouTube as well, because we're now starting the YouTube thing and we're going to start streaming on YouTube with a little bit more focus. And you are also welcome to check out our website and join the Global Ecosocialist Network. That's enough for me right now. I'm going to hand it over to Vijay, and just a second. There you go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sabrina. Sabrina is a tremendous person, and I'm very glad that she asked me to come here with you on a Saturday to this platform of the Global Ecosocialist Network. Very happy to be here. Just to remind you that there's 7.9 billion people on the planet, in case you've forgotten. 7.9 billion. And the vaccines that are out there are in the millions. I don't know if the estimates are correct, but I keep seeing estimates that say that if indeed everybody was to be vaccinated, this might not happen before 2023 or something like that. There are all kinds of estimates out there. This pandemic, COVID-19, this hasn't actually, broken the world. The world was broken before this virus came across. This virus has, I hope, shown people how broken the world has been, and particularly the capitalist part of the world, how deeply damaged it's been. So in the 15 minutes that I have, I want to do two things. I want to, on the one side, talk quite specifically about the current conjuncture we're in, where I think the question of the people's vaccine is a central issue. It's the only, or maybe one of the main human rights issues of our moment. But I also want to take some time to reflect on the deeper problems faced by the world, much deeper problems, because we shouldn't be in a situation where we're calling for a people's vaccine. And that's what I want to come to eventually. So, the first thing, a people's vaccine. My team at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research produced a red alert called a people's vaccine. And I very much would like you to download this. This is available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, French, a range of languages, Malayalam, and so on. I hope that you'll get a chance to read it. The way our red alerts work is we ask a question. Like, the first question is very simple: what is a vaccine? Many people have no idea what a vaccine is. Given the desert of possibilities in many of our countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, given the desert of possibilities, we are unable to produce vaccines for our own people. India used to be called the pharmacy of the global south. India continues to produce a large quantum of world pharmaceutical, vaccines and medicines and so on. But we've seen in the middle of this pandemic, Indian vaccine production is geared towards the North Atlantic countries. Vaccines are being purchased by the countries of Europe, of North America, and so on. There was that statistic that Canada has 5 vaccines per Canadian, when we know scientific community has told us that you only need 2. Well, with Johnson and Johnson, you only need 1, but they apparently have 5 per head. Well, they're buying some of this up from places like India, which was considered, the pharmacy of the global south. So we're in a situation now where countries unable to produce their own vaccines are basically asking various, formations, even the COVAX formation, charitable donations and so on, trying to get access to vaccines from other parts of the world, hoping that in the WTO, the South African and Indian plea for a waiver on the patent is going to go through, and so on. I mean, this is a situation of great seriousness. Countries are trying desperately to get vaccines for their population. It doesn't look as if it's going to be possible in the short term, partly because, there's a turning inward in the northern countries. There is what we are calling vaccine nationalism. Now, look, I want to put a pause on this for a second. Many years ago, I was in Morocco, sitting on a train, and I saw some Chinese doctors on the train. I went and talked to them, and they said that they were part of a brigade, a Chinese internationalist brigade that had come to Morocco. This was long before the pandemic. They had come to help assist people with maternal health of women having children. Now, I was quite surprised. I didn't know about Chinese medical internationalism. One had heard of Cuban medical internationalism. Cuban Henry Reeve Brigade is up for the Nobel Prize. I very much hope that you'll go to Cuba Nobel and join that campaign to make sure that the Cuban doctors honor the Nobel Prize, a prize that has been dishonored by its previous choices. So, we know that there's a tradition of medical internationalism from China, from Cuba, and so on. There is really no tradition of medical internationalism from the North Atlantic states. We don't see Swiss doctors in large numbers around the world in identifiable brigades going to sort things out in other countries. This is just not what happens. They create NGOs grudgingly, and then they want their name in lights. They give some money here and there, but they don't have a tradition of solidarity. They have a tradition of taking advantage of the world's people. Let's be fair and frank about this. The Cubans are not there to take advantage of the world's people. They don't export weapons, they export doctors. The Chinese export medical internationalism. They're providing their vaccines to people as much as possible. I think we need to put this on the table, that when we're talking about a people's vaccine, we're talking about the capitalist system, which is hoarding vaccines for their own countries. They don't have a tradition of medical solidarity, of medical internationalism. This is the immediate issue. And I know Fatima is going to get more into this. So I'm going to pause on this and go somewhere else. There are four elements that we've inherited from the past that need to be addressed. And I know these are long-term issues. These are not for the immediate conjuncture, but I want to put them on the table. But I'm going to focus on three of them. The first is on science and tech. The second is on pharmaceutical production. And the third is on the distribution of medicines or medical care in our societies. The way in which IMF austerity programs have worked over the course of the last several generations. We shouldn't talk about decades anymore. We should talk about generations. Over the course of the last several generations, the way in which IMF austerity programs have gone is that they've basically forced countries to cut back on their scientific apparatus, on public education, high-level public education. They've made us cut back spending on education. This is important because many of our countries no longer have indigenous medical and scientific developments taking place. We are reliant on scientific knowledge being produced elsewhere. Large numbers of our very brightest of young people go abroad to the West to study and so on. Our education systems have been degraded, have been destroyed because the IMF and austerity programs have forced us to not properly fund our education systems. If you don't have basic science, you can't produce technology. You see, just asking for technology from somewhere is not enough. Technology transfer is the transfer of yesterday's science. Science development is the production of tomorrow's technology. So we've got to fight to develop education apparatuses in our societies to build scientific capacity so we can come up with our own designs, not only for this vaccine, but for other pharmaceutical needs that we might have in our society. The second thing that we don't have in our societies anymore is the manufacturing capacity. I mean, I was quite stunned to hear that on the African continent, for instance, there's just one or two places with the capacity to produce these vaccines or any one of these vaccines. There's a number of them. There's just a few places. Well, I immediately think of Bill Clinton bombing the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan, calling it a terrorist factory that makes chemical weapons. It turns out it was entirely a pharmaceutical factory, bombed, not rebuilt. Our countries, except a few, Argentina, India, and so on, just have not been able to produce indigenous pharmaceutical production capacities. I think this is something that we need to put back on the table. We need to raise capital funds. We need to raise investment to produce regional pharmaceutical production entities. You don't need every country producing drugs, but if you had regional capacity, where is the African Union in this? Where is the various formations in South America? Where are the formations in Asia? Why can't we have a SARC, a South Asian regional pharmaceutical production capacity, which takes care of the entire region? Why do we have to rely upon a pharmaceutical production from elsewhere? Always talk about importing, always talk about patents being taken off. Why do we need to rely on that patent regime? So the second thing I want to put on the table is the evisceration, the destruction of pharmaceutical production capacity in our countries. It's not just about being able to get drugs in. This whole conversation about cold chains, how to move drugs, courier the vaccine over long distances, it should make us think that why are we in need of moving vaccines such long distances? Why can't we produce vaccines in our regions? It doesn't have to, again, just to underline this, be in every country. We need regional integration. We need to think about the regional development of pharmaceutical manufacturing. So the first point is about building up our education systems, building up science, building up tech, having to do this, again, perhaps regionally, not just nation by nation. And secondly, building up the pharmaceutical capacity. The third point I want to raise here is that this IMF generation-long austerity regime has destroyed public health systems in so many countries. At Tricontinental, we did a dossier, which I was really proud of, called Health is a Political Choice. It's a really good dossier, also available Spanish, Portuguese, etc. In this dossier, we interviewed health workers in Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and India. In South Africa, we talked to trade unionists of nurses and so on. And they gave us their views of how difficult it is to operate not only in this pandemic, but in normal situations. It's extraordinarily difficult because public health systems have been destroyed. Public health systems have been whittled down to almost nothing. You see, it's one thing to get a vaccine in house. You bring in a vaccine, that's fine. You get vaccines. Who's going to go and administer the vaccine? Who's going door to door? Who you have to train people now because you've not got that capacity in your society any longer. In India, for instance, the ASHA workers, almost all women, ASHA workers are treated as helpers, not as medical personnel. They're not given respect as medical workers. We have to build up public health systems. You've got to go back and look at the Alma Ata Declaration from 1978. One of the finest documents produced by the World Health Organization. Please go and look at the Alma Ata Declaration of 1978, WHO Declaration on Public Health. It is a fine document. We need to return to it. History needs to start again from 1978 onwards, because from 1978 till the present, we've destroyed public health systems. And I think this is something that should be very much part of the conversation when we're thinking about vaccines. To bring these points together, here's what I'd like us to think about. On the one hand, of course, we're in the middle of a crisis. The crisis has to be dealt with face forward. We have to demand the people's vaccine. There's no question about that. These initiatives are just insufficient, COVAX and so on. These are insufficient. You need to remove patent protections on these vaccines. We've got to have a ramped up production, got to open up production lines and so on. There's no question about that. If we don't do something like that, we are not human beings. That's got to be the immediate forthright demand. But behind that, underneath that, we have to remember, we must push an agenda that includes inculcating the scientific temper in our societies, increasing funding for education, particularly for science and technology development in our own societies, not relying on scientific developments elsewhere. Secondly, we've got to build up regional production capacity. Can't rely on having the import of vaccines or other pharmaceutical drugs from elsewhere. And thirdly, we have to rebuild public health systems. Many of the workers in these public health systems are women. It is outrageous, the treatment of women workers in this field. It has to be directly addressed. Trade unions of health workers must be supported at all times. Of course, all trade unions must be supported, but trade unions of health workers must be supported. It's imperative. This is one of those moments in world history where we have a choice to make. Either we show ourselves to be real human beings, or we just admit that we are barbarians. I hope that we'll make the correct choice. And by the way, Boris Johnson, the correct choice is not barbarian. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vijay. That was brilliant. And you stayed on time. You stuck to your 15 minutes. There are a number of big questions raised around Big Pharma, who now say that they can produce the 10 billion doses to meet global demand by the end of the year. Vaccines, are they the silver bullet? Certainly in social terms, no, but also possibly now in medical terms with the development of the variations. Vijay spoke, as I expected him to, glowingly of the World Health Organization. It hasn't been a completely easy ride with them. Maybe Fatima can pick up on this. Vijay also mentioned the World Trade Organization and the limitations there. Maybe Fatima, you can drill down a bit further on that. I know you got some very strong things to say on that front, but we're certainly facing a massive existential crisis, and what we do need, and I'll end on this point, is real movement to emerge, an international movement on this issue that can go beyond the World Health Organization, go beyond the World Trade Organization and really begin to pile up the pressure in our various societies, particularly in the global north. So we want to know, what is the vaccine situation in the country? What are you doing? And how we can begin to work together. And this is essentially the motivation behind this meeting, to begin to take those small steps towards that. Fatima Hassan's been an active and leading voice in the People's Vaccine Campaign of South Africa, and she will give you some pictures, a small picture of what we've been doing today in this regard. Thank you. Over to you, Fatima, and great to have you.
Thanks, Riyad and Sabrina and Vijay. And, you know, the other thing we should tell Boris Johnson, that greed is also not a sustainable solution to getting the world out of a pandemic of this magnitude. So, you know, what is the situation we're dealing with? We've had 3 million people around the world dying already because of COVID-19 related complications. I think if we look at the data around excess deaths, that figure is probably even higher, because our healthcare systems have basically been at strain, or in some parts of the world, they've actually been decimated because of the impact of COVID-19 or multiple lockdowns, or the socioeconomic impact of this pandemic. And I think, you know, while we've dealt with like quite a severe impact from a public health point of view, we've also in many parts of the world, including in functional democracies, given up a lot of our sovereignty. And I'd like to return to that issue later, of how this pandemic has actually taken away democratic gains and democratic rights. And the pharmaceutical industry is acting in a manner where their conduct is actively contributing to the undermining of democratic institutions and regulatory systems. So, you know, my introductory point is that the system has self-created scarcity. And this system that we're in, the capitalist system, whatever you want to call it, the free market system, the World Trade Organization in particular, and I'll emphasize, you know, some of the critiques around the way in which the World Trade Organization is operating in this particular pandemic, and obviously the way it did during the HIV/AIDS crisis. But it collectively has created a system of vaccine apartheid. This was something that could have been avoided. It could have been addressed already 12 months ago, but the political will was not there. And I think that the profiteering and the greed motive took precedent. So the net result is that population immunity globally is at risk. From a public health point of view, all of the public health experts we are working with are concerned about, obviously, the number of variants that are being discovered. But the longer it takes to vaccinate the entire world and entire regions, the greater risk we have of actually living with COVID for much longer time, and actually having vaccine-resistant strains to the current vaccines that are currently on the market. And so this means that the prospect of immunological equity in the world in this pandemic is at great risk. I mean, we're obviously not going to get formal and substantive equality and a whole range of socioeconomic indicators in the world anytime soon. So what this pandemic has actually created is that it's obviously highlighted, but it's worsened the equality crisis in the world. And that means that we're also in a situation where the scientific knowledge exists, where there are vaccines that are considered to be safe and effective that were, but they are not being shared fast enough. The knowledge is not being shared. The vaccine know-how is not being shared. The technology is not being shared deliberately. And so that creates immunological inequity. I mean, the current data that we have is that less than 5% of vaccines that have been administered, less than 5% of vaccines that have been manufactured and administered have actually been given in the continent of Africa. So in our own country, in South Africa, which is supposed to be, you know, the one of the wealthiest countries on the continent, only 250,000 healthcare workers have been given vaccines from a study trial. So the rest of us are basically all waiting, and the early indications are that even with our negotiating power, even with our so-called strong economy, we are only able to get sufficient supplies for our entire country by the end of February 2022. So that's quite a long period. This means that the situation for Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia is even more dire. And COVAX, I think, is part of that problem, right? It estimates that by the end of 2021, it's only able to cover, because of insufficient supplies, because it still relies on voluntary, cooperation of some of these drug companies, because a lot of these drug companies are honoring the pre-commitments that they made to a number of the richer nations who are already reaching 30, 40, 50% of their adults have already been vaccinated. I mean, in our country, not even a person who's over 65 has been vaccinated, but in New York, people who are 25 years old are making appointments for their vaccines, and they even have a choice of their vaccine. So COVAX has basically said and admitted that they've got a major supply crisis, they've got a major funding crisis, and they're only likely to reach about 27% of vulnerable people in lower income countries by the end of 2021. And in the Q&A session, we can go more into COVAX. So the latest, I think, quite worrying statistic is that 80% of people in low-income countries, so that's 8 out of 10 people in low-income countries, will not receive a vaccine in 2021. So that tells you that the situation that we're in, the systemic issues that we're dealing with around what Vijay called medical inequality or medical apartheid, or what I would call colonized global health systems, actually means that the scientific knowledge and the scientific investment into accelerated vaccine research is actually, once again, like with HIV/AIDS, not going to benefit people in the global south. And the irony of this is that South Africa, for example, participated in 4 of the front-runner vaccine trials, is now participating in a 5th. Brazil, people in Brazil also participated in the AstraZeneca trial. So the global south has contributed to scientific knowledge, but we can't benefit from it. And we were told to participate in those trials so that we would be in the front of the queue. But obviously, you should never rely on benevolence, and you should never rely on charity of the industry. So I want to make a point because of one important point because of developments that have happened in the last 2 weeks, both in Latin America and in South Africa. And I want to use that to illustrate that why I said in the beginning that we've basically given up a lot of our democratic gains around transparency, around accountability, around anti-corruption, around treating medicines as a public good instead of treating medicines as a commodity. And I think, part of the problem that we're in currently in the world is that the world order has continued and continues to allow to treat medicines, all life-saving medicines, vaccines, diagnostic testings, and kits as a commodity, as a car, as a piece of jewelry, as opposed to a life-saving intervention and something that actually could improve the quality of your life and allow you to attain a higher standard of health and also to live through this particular pandemic. So the irony of the situation that we're in when we start talking about a public good was that when Vijay talked about the accelerated vaccine research and the number of countries that actually contributed to that research and co-funded it, when it came to the research of vaccines, the pharmaceutical industry said, well, we need to partner with public institutions. We need to rely on the knowledge of public scientists, of work that had been done previously. And we also need co-funding from the US government, from the UK government, from the German government. There's a Lancet piece which shows that at least $10 billion has been invested in accelerated vaccine research. So this argument that all of the R&D, all of the research development cost was actually borne by the pharmaceutical industry is something that we as activists and as worker formations have to push back against. There's now a lot more data indicating that in the AstraZeneca case, 97% of the funding actually came from public sources or philanthropic sources. So in relation to the accelerated vaccine research within the space of a year, vaccines were almost treated as a public good, where the pharmaceutical industry said, well, you want us to help you to take you out of this pandemic, you've got to co-contribute to the research. And we can come to who owns the IP in relation to particularly the US co-funding from the NIH for the Moderna vaccine, J&J, and some of the others. But when it came to access issues, the supplies, the bilateral commitments, the contributions to COVAX, transparency, the invocation of non-disclosure agreements, the lack of transparency around pricing, sort of artificial no-profit, low-profit pledges, which nobody can figure out when those expire, when those remain in place, and the not sharing of technology and the vaccine know-how through mainly the opposition of the TRIPS waiver, then the vaccine was treated as a commodity. And what has happened in the last 2 weeks is now the industry is saying, well, go back to treating it as a public good, even though I'm not giving you the vaccine know-how and the knowledge, or sharing the technology, or allowing other companies to manufacture it. And Vijay, by the way, there's 6 different companies in Africa that if they were given the technology right now, they would be able to retrofit their facilities and actually manufacture some of the mRNA vaccine. But we can come to this myth around where is the manufacturing capacity and how we address that. So in relation to the no-fault compensation schemes and the indemnity waivers that Big Pharma wants, basically now the industry says, well, now treat it as a public good. We've done you a favor. We're bringing these vaccines. People need these vaccines. If there's going to be any damages claims, we want your government, and here's the irony, our government, which means our public money, have to underwrite these no-fault compensation schemes or indemnity schemes. And in the case of Latin America, they had to put sovereign assets on the table to basically provide the surety that they would underwrite the compensation scheme. So it's a bit surreal, right? And it's a bit of a self-contradiction that at certain parts of this pandemic, we must treat vaccine research and access to vaccines as a public good. But when it matters most in terms of access, in terms of sufficient access, timely, uninterrupted supplies, that's when intellectual property reigns supreme. But when it comes to the compensation schemes, we must revert back to this notion of, we're all in this together, and let's all provide some kind of human solidarity. The last point I wanted to make, Riyadh, was that, everybody should know that the reason why we're pushing for the waiver, for the compulsory sharing of technology and the transfer of the know-how is because we've got this immunological risk at play. It's because we want to treat medicines and vaccines and diagnostics. And remember, the waiver is not just about the vaccines, it's about all COVID-19 related technologies for the duration of the pandemic. That really, we have to change the world order to start treating that as a public good, not as a commodity. You can't have the same intellectual property rules for how you would deal with a handbag or a car or a piece of jewelry that you would for medicines. And I think that is the existential crisis that the industry is now facing, which explains, the high level of opposition to the waiver. But every single one of these companies, particularly the Western pharmaceutical companies, are facing a supply bottleneck crisis. They are all behind their production targets. And that gives us, I think, a better argument and the ammunition to say that despite what you're saying in your press statements about being able to produce enough supplies of those vaccines, and in some cases you have to do 2 shots, in some cases we may also need booster shots, you won't be able to meet the global demand by the end of the year. And if you can't meet global demand, then we've got to ramp up manufacturing urgently through the urgent sharing of technology and know-how. So let me end there, and then maybe we can deal with some of the other issues in the Q&A.
Lovely, thank you. Sabrina, I don't know if you've any questions, but how are we going to run this? I'm assuming that nobody can come in personally, that the questions have to be written.
So we have already a few comments that people have posted both on Facebook and YouTube about how things are going. I can highlight them on the screen, but I also welcome other people to keep posting their questions and also reports. Like, we're interested to know how the vaccine rollout is working, where you are right now. We have people from different places, like different continents actually here. So it'd be nice to have some of their input. But perhaps, Riyadh, if you could go ahead with some of your comments and questions, and then I can highlight them as people add some more over here.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to go and get some water and some tobacco. I don't know what you have to say, Vijay, about the question of vaccines and this, them being a silver bullet and so on. I mean, Fatima did speak to the issue of mutations now, but it seems we're not going to have an easy exit in any way from COVID. It also seems clear from the intensity of these pandemics, or certainly these pathogens over the last 30 years or so, maybe 40 years, starting with HIV, that we are in the age of pandemics. I noticed a few months back, the GS of the World Health Organization also has mentioned this is a dry run for the climate crisis. What are the parallels here? between the and the connections between the ecological crisis that we're facing and the very real health crisis can capitalism deliver essentially on what we need it to in this moment? Is this a make or break moment in terms for the ability to see international collaboration, burden sharing, patent, the coming, we've got a problem with energy sovereignty because of patents and so on. China's a big problem. There's a major problem in many ways, holding much of the technology around renewable energy. So there are many great things, Fatima was particularly on point about a number of the issues. Are there a way out? And what is happening in the global north around this demand for the people's vaccine? We've seen declarations from global leaders. We've seen some small protests from the likes of MSF and other global alliances, but nothing seems to be rooted.
I think Riyadh is frozen there. Maybe Fatima, did you want to come in on this while Riyadh is disappeared?
Yeah, you can go ahead, and once we get Riyadh back, he can finish his comments.
I think you should start, Vijay.
Well, Fatima, it's hard to answer Riyadh's question. I'm not a scientist, so I can't talk about whether the vaccine is a silver bullet or not. I'm looking at it from a very different perspective. The first thing I learned, in recent days, I was quite stunned to see when the United States government hosted the Quad Summit with Japan, India, and Australia. This Quad is a formation set up essentially to encircle and threaten China. But at the Quad Summit, they talked a lot about vaccines. And the US government, the administration of Mr. Joe Biden, they talked about things like, here, we will join forces to expand safe, affordable, and effective vaccine production and equitable access and so on. This is what they talked about. This is what the Biden administration said on the record to speed economic recovery, benefit global health, and so on. Meanwhile, they have, of course, the Defense Production Act in place. Now, what is this Defense Production Act? In India, there is the Serum Institute, which produces vaccines, has complained for a long time. Serum Institute has complained for a long time that as a consequence of this Defense Production Act, the US government prevents the export out of the United States of filters, solutions, plastic bags, various things that are necessary for the production of the vaccine. And the Serum Institute and the government of Mr. Narendra Modi, which is fundamentally subordinate to the United States government, have made small noises about this, but they haven't actually come in a frontal statement saying you can't, on the one hand, at the Quad meeting, talk about, wanting to push for expanding safe, affordable, and effective vaccine production, and on the other side, deny the Serum Institute of India with necessary inputs for the production of vaccines. So why I'm saying this? I mean, I think the rank hypocrisy of particularly the G7 countries in this needs to be put on the table. I mean, we just can't believe anything they say. Look, when India and South Africa came out there and talked about the COVID-19 technology access pool, the CTAP thing to lift the patents for a waiver and so on for production. It's a perfectly honorable and decent proposal, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic, millions of people affected, billions of people's social lives affected, and so on. And India, South Africa come to the WTO with a pretty reasonable thing, which is just, they're not talking about let's roll back TRIPS. I am of the view, let's junk TRIPS. I am of the view, let's junk intellectual property rights for all pharmaceuticals. It should all come into the commons. I quite agree with you, Fatima. There's a difference between a handbag and a life-saving vaccine. You know, there's a great difference. It's not a commodity. It should be a public good. Quite agree with you. So India, South Africa come there with the perfectly decent proposals, not a radical proposal. They're not asking for a rollback on TRIPS. They're just saying, in this case, can't we have a waiver in this case, in the middle of a bloody pandemic? And what do these countries say? These countries that talk about, you know, we need to join forces to expand safe, affordable, and effective vaccine production. Bullshit. Bullshit. You don't actually. The actual practice demonstrates that you want to maintain the TRIPS in terms even of this vaccine, because you don't want to open the door. You don't want to open the door. You think this waiver challenges the principle of TRIPS, and you're not even allowing the export of ancillary materials such as, you know, filters and solutions, because you have this Defense Production Act. So we need to call them out for what they are. They are not reliable partners, Fatima. I mean, they are not reliable partners. The South has to get it together by itself, put a united front forward and say, no pasaran. We will not accept this sort of rhetoric coming from you. We're going to put our own project forward.
So, I mean, I'm just going to jump in because I don't know where Riyadh is and Sabrine, but I totally agree with you, Vijay. And I think that the double standard cuts in multiple ways, right? So India and South Africa go and ask for a TRIPS waiver, but meanwhile back home, India is, facing its own domestic political crisis, and it introduced its own export ban. South Africa decided not to use measures available to it against its pharmaceutical industry representatives, but it's also not been very transparent and accountable, and in many respects has made a lot of bungles in relation to the vaccine program in South Africa, which is why we're still in April 21, all still waiting for our vaccines. So I don't, while there are countries in the global south that are taking leadership around the TRIPS waiver, and you're right, it's, we didn't think that in this pandemic that there would be so much opposition from the pharmaceutical industry and about 10 or 11 countries, and obviously, Europe as an entire bloc that would so vehemently oppose the TRIPS waiver. It's within the rules. It's basically located within the structure and the framework of TRIPS, of the TRIPS agreement, and yet it's still being opposed. And so if you don't allow any kind of concessions, and that's a concern we have as activists, if you don't even allow a waiver, let alone a compulsory license, I mean, no countries even tried to seek that. There's one attempt in Canada, and, the Netherlands took some action against Roche. But if you can't succeed with the waiver in this pandemic, with its devastating impact, then the chances of being able to respond to the next pandemic and the pandemic after that in a more meaningful way, or around the high cost of cancer medicines or HIV medicines or any other medicine for, diabetes, for example, then basically that is going to be close to us. And so as civil society activists, we've got to push our governments in the global south a bit more, I think, to also use the powers available to it, to stop acting as if it's so powerless, to, at least comply with some of the democratic principles that it's agreed to, in the case of South Africa, for example, our constitution. And we can come to the issue of trade pressure and how the industry normally operates, and the myths and the narratives that they're basically using some very sophisticated PR companies to be spreading around the world. But let's just go back to the EU and the US and the Defense Force Act. I think that's such an important point, Vijay. I mean, as activists in South Africa, we wrote in, I think, February already to the Biden administration to say, you have the means available to you because you co-funded, and in many cases, you co-own some of these vaccines, particularly the mRNA vaccines. And I mean, we have our eye on the Moderna vaccine because it potentially could be really effective for a situation such as South Africa, in relation to the variants that we've discovered here. And we've said, use the Defense Force Act to exercise your power against the pharmaceutical industry, yes, but beyond the borders of the US. And so that is the latest push, that the US government must use the Defense Force Act beyond the borders of the US and for the benefit of the whole world. I mean, yesterday Serum tweeted basically begging and pleading to the Biden administration to say, if you don't lift the ban on the export of APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, we are unable to make the vaccines that AstraZeneca and Oxford University has asked us to make for 20 middle income and 20 low income countries. And the irony of this, and somebody at some point is going to have to plot all of this, is that when we dug into the Serum Institute agreement, who's the preferred customer? If there's a supply crisis in the UK, the supplies have to be immediately diverted to the UK, right? So the ban is in effect affecting Serum's ability to even send vaccines to the UK. Similarly, the EU has placed an export ban. I mean, the EU was the first to start, introducing this notion of export bans. So sort of the US first, EU first kind of nationalism. And so we saw the nationalism playing out not just in terms of access to vaccine supplies, but also nationalism in terms of who can send supplies to whom. And the irony of what happened in the last few weeks with this massive supply crisis globally, and which is why we talk about scarcity and the need to ration, is that the EU, Italy, blocked a ship of supplies that was meant to go to Australia. And so what is happening in the geopolitical realm is that people in those particular countries, and we must call out the WHO as well and COVAX for not using what we call the Russian and Chinese vaccines, right? They still haven't included them. They're not in any kind of WHO pre-qualification system. COVAX hasn't entered into agreement with Sputnik or Sinopharm or Sinovac, for example. It's relying on AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson. A lot of our own regulatory authorities are only relying on what we call Western pharmaceuticals. So the way in which this is playing out is that it may be US first or EU first, but even against countries in the global north, even against richer nations, they are basically saying, we've got to do our citizens first. And I mean, it explains also the percentage of vaccination disparities within the EU, where people in the EU are basically rising up and saying to the EU Parliament, well, what have you, actually done? I mean, so far, there's only 2 places that we know of that by April 2021 has reached beyond 50%. That's Israel, which has its own complication around the fact that is that an effective rollout if you exclude every single person under your occupation? How can that be regarded as an effective rollout? Because it has so many, not just public health implications, but human rights implications as well. And the UK, which has just reached 50%, of all adults that needed to be getting vaccinated. The US is still at 38%. Many parts of Europe are under 20%, and I think that's why you see also some of the pushback in Germany, in other parts of the world. And the irony is where the WHO is situated, in Switzerland, in Geneva. I mean, they have very low vaccination rates. So it's such a self-defeating strategy to defend IP at all costs, when you have at least 4 or 5 different vaccines in the world that could save people's lives. And yes, it may not be, a silver bullet, but in many parts of where we come from, it's one of the most important interventions that could actually have a, dramatic impact on our ability to, one, respond to this pandemic from a public health point of view, reduce morbidity and mortality, and actually take us out of multiple lockdowns, take us out of the repression and the associated violence that comes with, governments having the authority to continuously declare a disaster and to use that then to perpetuate human rights violations. Sorry, I just get very angry about, the role of the WTO. We've seen this before with HIV/AIDS. At the moment, as an African person, I can say that everybody got all excited about the first African woman becoming the DG of the WTO. What's the first thing she did? Yes, she called out vaccine nationalism, but she's punting the third wave. We have to call that out. As Global South activists, we have to call that out. That is derailing from the broader purpose of getting a full waiver, which would make it significantly easier, which does not rely on, the volunteerism of the pharmaceutical industry. And right now, in my view, the WTO is one of the largest obstacles to the world attaining immunological immunity, population immunity globally with sufficient numbers of people, and is a key obstacle to continuing our ability to be able to access affordable medicines. And so the system has to change. The WTO, we need to change it. The rules, we need to change it. We can't rely on the waiver provisions in Doha in the next pandemic. I mean, but if we're going to do that, then basically more people are going to die and more people are going to suffer. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the way in which the WTO is designed to pander to the interests and the demands of pharmaceutical industries. And at the moment, 10 countries are holding the entire world hostage, where they are blocking the waiver. Over 100 countries support the waiver. 57 are co-sponsoring the proposal, and yet they're still blocking it. And if you look at the countries that are blocking it, they're the ones who've started their vaccinations. They are the ones who've secured, enough supplies multiple times over, like Canada and Japan and Australia. And they are the ones who are also going to be drawing supplies from COVAX, because, the myth around COVAX is that it's only for low-income countries. It's not. It's for high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. And who gets first bid on the supplies that come into COVAX? The people who actually put the money, up front in advance. So if you, Zimbabwe, you will have to wait until the high-income countries and middle-income countries gets their share of the pie. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatima. That was great. I do want to zoom out for a minute. I mean, these countries in particular are the heart of, in many ways, the manufacturing base for Big Pharma. And we know Big Pharma is the third biggest industrial sector in the world, with a massive lobby, and who spend millions upon millions of dollars on lobbying. We also know that Big Pharma spend more on advertising than they do on R&D. And that they've become, in the words of Mike Davis, a brake on biomedical advances, particularly in those markets which are not lucrative to them, where there are not repeat medications and so on. They say that vaccines is a once-off jab and so on, and they can't really be making the big monies that they seek to. So how should we be seeing Big Pharma? What are the measures that need to be taken against Big Pharma? And do we need now to be pushing for a vote at the WTO? We know historically it only worked on consensus. We know that the configuration of forces is a massive majority behind South Africa's position and India's position. But why are our own specific countries, and Vijay, I can hear your Indian accent, and Fatima's from South Africa, why are they so weak? Why are they so timid in this fight? How can we understand our respective countries' timidity on this issue? So over to you both. There's questions.
About maybe now a decade ago, I published a book called The Poorer Nations, where I told the story of the class alignments of the governments of our countries, India, South Africa, country like Brazil, and so on. The class alignments of those who run these countries and the forces in the global north. There is a great harmony that is taking place, in these zones. Look, we've had the warning lights go on repeatedly about the commodification of different parts of human life which should not be commodified. We've had that light go up when the Enron crisis took place around energy. Do you really need energy systems to be privatized? Recently in the United States, in Texas, there was a total collapse of the energy grid. Do you really need energy grids to be privatized? Shouldn't this be part of the commons? Shouldn't pharmaceutical industries be part of the commons? Can't they be in the public sector? In Russia and China, they're in the public sector. By the way, until mid-March, the Russians and the Chinese provided over 800 million doses of the vaccines to over 41 countries. That should be mentioned. These are public sector enterprises. They have their own different attitude towards pharmaceutical systems. One might say this or that about them, but they're certainly different from the totally self-absorbed capitalist type of pharmaceutical industries you have, like Pfizer and others. Moderna received, I don't know, I have it written down somewhere, $2.5 billion from the US government to develop the vaccine. At that point, why didn't the US government just take over Moderna, just nationalize it? Why can't these things be thought of as being part of the commons? Why must they remain in as private enterprises? The argument they'll give is, well, you see, if you don't have intellectual property protections, then why would people design things? Why would they go and develop vaccines and so on? Firstly, as Fatima already pointed out, there's a lot of public money that goes to finance, from science all the way out to technology, that goes to finance things like vaccines or other pharmaceuticals. The other thing is, the people who are actually doing the development, the scientists, the technologists and so on, they are not working for the money, guys. Let's face it, okay? They are like teachers. They are there because they want to solve puzzles. They are very interested in what they're doing. Many of them are totally captivated by the desire to help humanity. Those who are working, say, for a cure for cancer, they're not doing it for the money. Come on, let's face it. The people in the white coat sitting in the labs, many of them are out there because they love doing what they're doing. But it's the pharmaceutical companies that have commodified the work of these people that come out there with this garbage argument that if you don't have intellectual property protections, if you don't allow them to make billions of dollars selling life-saving drugs to people, if you don't allow them to actually, in a sense, make toxic the pharmaceutical choices, why is it that there are so many drugs for, ailments that affect people in the West, but then simple things like cures for the various easily vaccinatable diseases in the global South, or cures for things like malaria, medicines for malaria, big killer in India, why aren't they focusing on that? This is a choice that the private sector, profit-driven pharma industry makes, where they say there's more money to be made selling things in say, Germany than selling things in Botswana. That's outrageous. We need to be very clear and straightforward about that. I believe there is no substitute to calling for public sector pharma. We should bring medical care back into the public sector, take it away from privatization. By this I mean from basic care, hospitalization, nursing care, and so on. All of it should be in the public sector. Now, you might say, look, public sector enterprises, they have the inefficiencies. Sure, they have the inefficiencies. Let's address those inefficiencies. The panacea to the problems of the public sector is not privatization. It's making more efficient public sector delivery. That's the panacea. I think we fell into a trap about 30, 40 years ago when the Thatcher, Reagans and others sold this bag of goods about privatization being the panacea for everything. And look where it's got us. I mean, it's brought us into a desert of human possibilities. We need to be a little more aggressive in the way we argue against privatization as a panacea. I'm afraid many of us are too timid. Now we've fallen into this trap, public-private partnership. Seriously, there is no such thing as public-private partnership. This is a code word for privatization, using the public sector as a Trojan horse. I don't want public-private partnership, friends. I want a robust, efficient public sector to be created with the people's money to create public goods for the people. We don't need privatization. Privatization basically means profiteering. During a wartime, we have a term, we call them war profiteers. And it's a highly, it's a bad thing to be called a war profiteer. We should talk about pandemic profiteering. What is Moderna? What is Pfizer? What are these companies? They are pandemic profiteers. They are not helping humanity. They are pandemic profiteers. And to what end?
Beautiful. Thank you, Vijay. I see you didn't want to come out openly against your government. Hopefully Fatima will. Can we talk a bit about that as well? This whole question of, which you've spoken about, Fatima, is an artificially created scarcity of the vaccine. I think that would also be useful. But please do try and help us understand why our specific relative governments who are leading this motion at WTO aren't doing it as aggressively as we'd hoped them to be doing so.
So I can go there. I mean, the delegations for the Indian and South African government will tell you that they've been pushing it, that they've been aggressive, and in some cases that's correct, right? There's been about 8 or 9 different formal and informal meetings. At every opportunity when there could be a discussion on this, the strategy of the industry and of the governments that from the beginning, from October 2020, have been opposing the waiver, has been to raise a technical query, to ask more questions, to ask questions in in a different way to questions that they've asked already, to prolong the negotiations. And there is a resistance to moving towards text-based negotiations. And so that may still take some time. And if we had gone to, a text-based negotiation, we potentially could have had a solution much sooner. Or if we had not had the opposition that we had already from October, I think the world would have been in a very different situation. And I think the researchers among us one day will have to do that, where we tell the story of the shame of contributing to unnecessary suffering and death. And I think it's something that we're trying to also quantify during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. But Vijay is right. The pandemic profiteering has extended not, from the time of masks to the time of hand sanitizer to oxygen to ventilators to dexamethasone, the substitute, the steroids when you're hospitalized with severe COVID. And what we are seeing is that the trade regime that the world has given us, which resides in the WTO through TRIPS, is basically enabling a system of gouging. So I would go even further than using pandemic profiteering and say this is gouging. This is what we call the behavior of companies, a handful of them, some CEOs and their shareholders. And so look who are the shareholders of Johnson & Johnson. Look at the MIT shareholders sitting in Moderna. And we have to be asking those shareholders, have you no shame? How can you justify your conduct in this pandemic? And let's use Moderna as an example. Vijay has talked about the significant amount of funding that has been put by the US government. So our estimates are that almost exclusively was actually funded by the US government. Our argument is also that the US government owns that technology, that it's the NIH Moderna vaccine. It's not Moderna's vaccine alone. But when you are an industry that is so profitable, that is allowed to gouge in a pandemic, that is allowed to privatize healthcare services, right, which is even more profitable than the oil and gas industry, you have so much power. You can lobby governments to make sure they oppose the waiver. But you can also decide, you can play God in a pandemic like Moderna is doing and decide in 2021, even though we have a great vaccine that could work, we will not enter middle income, some middle income and all low income markets. So they haven't even submitted a regulatory dossier in South Africa. They refuse to. And they refuse to sub-license anybody else. So when you ask the question about artificial scarcity, that is how artificial scarcity is created. There's the technology, there's the know-how, like we saw with antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS. There are companies that are willing to invest into their facilities to make it ready to be able to do a version of that vaccine, but you refuse to share the technology know-how on the basis that you own the intellectual property, which is a disputed argument. So it goes back to your point, Riyad. Why is the US government so scared then of exercising its rights that it has, of using the technology that it owns for the benefit of the world? Because it's saying all these things at Quad, and it says these things at different meetings, at different assemblies. And similarly, why are governments in the Global South unable to challenge that power? I mean, our governments have allowed non-disclosure agreements, have allowed no-fault compensation schemes, indemnity waivers, everything that the industry has asked. Basically, the industry has said jump, and our governments have said how high, how much higher, in order for them to get vaccines. And the reason, I think, and this is not to apologize for our government, but to explain the global trade context that we're in, is because the pharmaceutical industry has a lot of power. Like I said, even more profitable than oil and gas. And it has a lot of lobbying power. And it has a sophisticated PR strategy. And it has armies of lawyers. When a government like South Africa wanted to take action against the global pharmaceutical industry, what happened? Do you remember Nelson Mandela? I mean, Mandela is sued by the pharmaceutical industry. So that tells you how low their concern is about, whether they're being named in shame, what their image is. I mean, eventually they withdrew that case, but it came at great consequence for us because it meant that our government never took the necessary measures. And why didn't it take the necessary measures? It wasn't the litigation. It was that we were put on the US trade watch list by the Clinton administration. The trade pressure that results from the global south even mentioning the word compulsory license, ask Thailand, ask Brazil, they will tell you about the experience. That is what our governments are scared of, which is why, and they may have been naive, they went the waiver route. The waiver route takes away the scrutiny from one individual country or two or three or four. It avoids litigation. It avoids individual actions against different countries and different governments. And it also allows for the possibility, for example, for Zimbabwe to benefit from the waiver because it may not have a functional government or it may not have the necessary laws in place. I'm just using that as an example. So, the waiver was there for a reason. It was a political choice. And I think it's a political choice to oppose it. Why is Japan opposing the waiver? They want people to travel for the Olympics. This is self-defeating. It makes no sense. You could enable the rapid manufacturing and, the scale up of supplies so that, in fact, everybody by the end of 2021 could get at least one dose of a vaccine. So it's just so self-defeating. It makes no sense, except if you then start looking at the bottom line and the numbers. And what are people saying now, Riyadh? That the way in which the virus is mutating, the way in which this pandemic is playing out, you're not just going to need the one-dose vaccine in 2021. You're going to need it for years to come. You're going to need a booster shot. In some cases with Pfizer, the CEO has just said, you may need a third shot of our vaccine. So we're taking 20 million vaccines from Pfizer. We're going to be stuck in a regimen where we're going to have to get the third shot from them, right? So the potential to make even trillions of profit through this pandemic now exists. And I think it's firmly there for all of us to see. So yes, you may be offered $10 now, but remember they said that the low profit, no profit pledge is for the duration of the pandemic. They're going to decide when this pandemic is over, not the WHO. They will decide, in terms of the agreements that they've signed, they will decide when the pandemic is over, and then they will go to a full profit price. I mean, Moderna is already starting out at something at like, more than $40 for a vaccine that was actually co-funded by US government money. So I think that just tells you the absurd profiteering situation that we're in.
Okay,
sorry
wonderful.
For speaking wonderful. So much.
No, you were brilliant. Vijay, maybe you want to come in here. And we're going to end up, and these will be your last two sets of comments. People say, well, some of the countries are saying you have clauses where you can go ahead and produce these vaccines, these life-saving drugs and so on. But why don't you just use these clauses? I know Big Pharma are making noise about that. Instead of giving way to this general waiver motion from India and South Africa. Finally, I mean, Vijay, I don't think you're no longer based in India, but where does India sit in all this? They are a big player in terms of the global South vaccine manufacture. Why aren't they actually just going ahead and producing a generic vaccine? I don't know whether you're able to answer that, but these are, you began, so this is your last bite at the cherry, so to speak. So anything else that's been prompted by Fatima, please do come in.
Okay, great. This has been really a very interesting discussion, and Fatima, it's a pleasure to share this space with you. Mainly because your work is so important in driving, a seam of thought and action to create a just world, especially in terms of pharma, but in particular in the middle of this pandemic. And I agree with you. The pandemic, the all clear whistle should be blown not by the pharmaceutical companies, because they have a financial motive in blowing the all clear early rather than later. I've covered the UNCTAD meetings. UNCTAD is the UN Conference on Trade and Development, set up in 1964. It's largely dominated by the global South countries, and I've watched since the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1994. I've watched the attempt by the countries of the G7, the United States in the lead, but also several European countries trying to downgrade UNCTAD, set it aside, make the WTO the only game in town when it comes to trade and development. And I remember watching at an UNCTAD meeting, the Swiss diplomat who spoke on behalf of the Europeans, who basically looked at the draft document that UNCTAD had put forward. A lot of it has got to do with industrialization of the global South, the need to produce pharmaceutical production. In fact, last May, UNCTAD again called for putting pharmaceutical production lines back on the agenda, that there needs to be industrialization in the global South, shouldn't rely on global North, and so on. And I watched this Swiss diplomat. He said to the assembled crowd, he said that, look, I'm just going to take so long editing this text that you won't be able to get a text out from this meeting, because essentially we want to junk UNCTAD. That's the attitude of the governments of the North. I want to put that on the record. That's their attitude. They have absolute contempt for the vast mass of the people of the world. They have absolute contempt. That contempt is contagious. It has entered into the governments of the South. The government of Mr. Narendra Modi, for instance, has contempt for its population. He is currently campaigning in West Bengal, where there's an election. The left parties have suspended the election campaigning, saying it's too dangerous. There is a so-called second wave in India. Second wave, third wave, fourth wave. Who's keeping track of this? Mr. Modi has total contempt. He's more interested in what the United States government thinks of him than of what the Indian people think of his attitude towards them when it comes to this pandemic. So India is not going to take the lead, I'm afraid, in producing an Indian vaccine or anything. I mean, look at the contempt that the Modi government has had for the Serum Institute's plea. Why hasn't Mr. Modi come out there and made a public statement saying the US government should suspend this Defense Production Act restrictions on goods imported into India? Why hasn't he done that? He has contempt for his own population. This is what I mean. We should first recognize the contempt that countries of the North have for the peoples of the South, and then that is a totally infectious thing. I want to come back and say that, yes, there is an immediate problem we have to sort out. This pandemic is with us now. It's an immediate problem. There's a longer term problem. There's a much longer term problem, is that after this pandemic ends, when the all clear is blown, let's not return back to so-called normal. Let's not allow pharmaceuticals to remain in private hands. Let's push for a public sector kind of approach. Let's come to talk about regionalism. Why can't there be a regional solution to the production of pharmaceutical drugs? Why can't there be a discussion about public sector education? Because we need to improve our science and technology. We can't rely on countries abroad from whom we are begging for waivers. We're begging them to show us what the patent is. Can't rely. We have to produce our own things. Look at Cuba. Cuba, country of 11 million people. 11 million people. They have their own science and technology. They produce their own vaccines. They are vaccinating everybody on the island. They are saying anybody can come to Cuba and get vaccinated. They are ready to export their vaccine at no cost, only at production. I mean, that is something. If you asked me who is coming out well during this particular pandemic, I would say look to Cuba. Look at the attitude of the Cuban government towards the world and towards this public health crisis. They are showing us something quite different. If I was to pick between Moderna and Cuba, it's Cuba any day.
Thank you, Vijay. I've been informed that we do have some minutes left before we bring in Fatima back for questions. Sabrina, can you help us here?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention some of the comments. I tried to highlight them throughout the way, but there were some comments that related to some of the things you were saying. So, for example, the situation, for example, that Monique has brought up about internal inequalities. So in places where the states, the districts, they're actually responsible for vaccination, and that's creating some change. So this is the situation in Brazil. Depending on the state where you live, people are even going across borders to be able to vaccinate, because the difference can be quite strong. And Fatima actually mentioned Israel a bit, and Monique asked the same question related to this, because there seems to be some sort of whitewashing, perhaps, like use of the healthcare in that sense, by Israel to show itself as very efficient. But wouldn't you say like those are actually like very manipulated statistics? Like they're not real statistics, yet media bought those statistics very easily. They just like use those numbers, those percentages, without questioning anything related to that. So if you could perhaps speak about internal differences, even if it's in the same country. And there were some more comments here talking about, for example, Debashis was talking about like this situation, commenting on what Vijay was talking about related to how there's also a system of inequality and how this is being put forward in India. So using the class caste system in India. So if you perhaps can make some comments about that, and I'll just highlight everything else here as you were saying. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Just to talk about the third booster shot. Yeah, I'm Monday going for what I think is my third booster shot on the Novavax trial. I was on that. I'm apparently going to get two because they're not wanting to unblind anyone. So we're all getting two. So there can never be, it looks like, a shortage of vaccines. Just on that, the question of the efficacy of AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. This is being touted, these vaccines, as the answer to the global's health. Cheap, available, low refrigeration temperatures, and therefore appropriate for our setting, our health environment and the state of our health sector. Should we be raising questions? It seems the mRNA technology of Pfizer and Moderna is much more effective at fighting mutations and so on. Are we in a position to say, okay, I know we've got this immediate problem, but maybe mRNA is the solution for the world, and they're easily able to adapt these vaccines for the new variants that are coming along. They could do that in a quicker phase. The very important question that's coming from the audience, in many middle-income countries and some low-income countries, we've got vast wealth disparity, and it's in many ways this is a microcosm for what's happening in the world in terms of vaccine access. I know in South Africa, to me, you can talk about what certain sections of our society have been pushing for in terms of private procurement and so on. So over to you both. These will be your final comments. And this time I'm going to go over to Fatima, and Vijay, you will give us our final words. Thank you.
So, I'll try and answer some of those questions, but sort of against the background of the way I've defined this pandemic is that it's characterized by three things: secrecy on the part of governments and the pharmaceutical industry, power, and profit. And so when you're dealing with those three elements in this response to this pandemic, then geography plays a big role. And that is why, the issue of sanctions against Cuba and its ability to provide vaccines to the global south becomes an issue. And, the fact that you can't make a lot of money from the Cuban vaccines is probably going to be the reason why COVAX or, many countries in the global south and global north don't even choose that particular vaccine. And that element of secrecy, power, and profit, and geography, where people live and who gets a vaccine and who doesn't, is the reason why 14% of the world's population in the global north and some in middle-income countries have more than half of the world's current supply of vaccines. So, we're in a serious problem. So I mentioned secrecy because you asked about Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. And what we've also seen in this pandemic, which is quite concerning, is that there's been a response to this pandemic through press releases. So the decisions around vaccine selection, whether you're choosing Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, to the exclusion of the Cuban vaccines, or Sinopharm, or Sinovac, or Sputnik, there's one vaccine being currently researched in India as well, is that if you don't share information around the data, then the vaccine selection decisions being made in the global north and global south, I think, leave a lot to be desired, because we really don't know what's informing a lot of the decisions around why certain vaccines are being prioritized or not. And in South Africa, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine rollout has been paused, and we have, our country has also decided not to use AstraZeneca, which leaves us with basically Pfizer at the moment, if the supplies eventually arrive, and Moderna has said they don't really want to enter the South African market. So yeah, basically we have very limited options unless Sputnik is approved in the next few weeks. But let me answer the question about Israel and the public-private divide and what's happening in the US and the role of the media in this pandemic. And we've been disappointed because, save for a handful of investigative journalists, because of the way in which the power of the industry operates, there's almost a hands-off approach by the media on doing deep dive stories about the collusion amongst the industry, about how they exercise their power and why secrecy is so harmful. And, it's almost to the point where civil society is now having to do shadow reports and have to do shadow information briefs about Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer or AstraZeneca, or, for example, any of the companies, Moderna included, and their shareholders, because the media is basically too scared of writing in many cases because they will be sued, and we know that has happened in the past, or they are too deferential to those private sector interests around, the role of the free market and why the market is important in making decisions around access to medicine. So the Israel numbers and the US numbers, whoever asked the question, you're right. Both of those have to be dealt with a bit more scrutiny. Israel, I think that's obvious because I've talked about it before around excluding, the entire number of people who are under occupation and only slowly now introducing vaccines, and that was sort of brokered through UNICEF as well. But in the US, you're seeing this number of 30-35%. But what we are now finding out through data that's being released by a lot of US groups and activists working in public health is that Black Americans, so over 65, over 75, in many states are not receiving the vaccines. And white Americans, for example, and somebody raised the example of Brazil as well, who are 35, who are in New York, are getting access to the vaccine. So there is definitely in the allocation and what we call equitable allocation, there's huge fights that are still to be had. And Riaz mentioned, I'll just briefly talk about the South Africa situation, where a small trade union, who in my view is a right-wing trade union, wanted to force the South African government to allow private players into the market. And we saw an attempt like that in India as well, and if I'm not mistaken, in Indonesia, to move away from the principle of equity in a pandemic, where the private providers and those who have medical insurance basically wanted to get their own supply of vaccines and start vaccinating their members first, which meant that a person with a job or medical insurance would get a vaccine before a person, with a comorbidity of 65. And that's something we have to push against. There, the WHO actually has been useful. They've issued some guidelines and principles, the SAGE principles around equitable allocation. The question is whether governments who are being pressured around where are our vaccines, right, from the public, may eventually just give in and say, fine, the private sector, do your own thing, and we'll just deal with the public health sector. And that links to Vijay's point earlier. That's the danger of the continued privatization of healthcare, and we must make sure that that does not happen. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you, Vijay. Over to you, Fatima. Wonderful. Thank you for your participation today. Been a treasure trove of insight and information. Vijay, I know you've got a number of big picture things to say, but we're not here just to discuss ideas for ideas' sake. This is the Global Ecosocialist Network. It's a pretty big international network. how do we begin to take those steps to move to be building the international solidarity that's required in this moment?
That's a big question, Rihad. In just a few minutes, we're having, I think, to do two things. One is we're in a battle of ideas. I think that's key. I want people to go and take a look at our Tricontinental Red Alert called a People's Vaccine. We're on a battle of ideas. We're fighting against an enormous propaganda, let's say, propaganda offensive from pharmaceutical industries. We know, for instance, that drugs that private pharma make are not as expensive as they say they are to produce. We know that the consumers are paying twice, because they pay once in funding the drugs with public sector funding, and secondly, they pay to buy the drugs. So you're actually getting billed twice. We know that many of these private companies are not so great at innovation. We know that there's a lot of studies about that. Often that they extend patents beyond necessity. The new things that they have on offer are not any better than the older ones. We know this. There's a lot of research. We know that there is a general thrust against the public sector. Look, this cruel, inhuman sanctions against Venezuela, against Iran, are against the public sector. You see, Iran has a public sector health delivery system, and the sanctions against Iran means that public health system is being directly attacked. There's a tendency to push for privatization of public health in Iran. Same in Venezuela. It's a public health system, and the sanctions regime goes against that. There is a way in which these countries are willing to saw the branch on which they are sitting to defend the principles of privatization and profit. You know, when Fatima earlier said, look, you know, here's the Tokyo Olympics, why not let everybody have a vaccine, then you can have people come for it. They would prefer to saw the branch on which they are sitting to defend the principle of profit, the principle of intellectual property. That principle is more important to them than humanity. I mean, this is the battle of ideas we're in. We want to build a genuine, strong movement against this. We have to first go amongst the trade unions of healthcare providers. They are people who have been fighting. In Brazil, the trade unions of healthcare providers have gone to the International Criminal Court. They have put a case against Jair Bolsonaro, accusing him of crimes against humanity. You know, those healthcare workers, the healthcare workers in South Africa, the healthcare workers in India, the ASHA workers, these women who go door to door during the pandemic for what is known basically as not a salary. They are being paid an honorarium. It's ridiculous. You know, it's a crime. We've got to link up, you know, the healthcare providers. That's the first base of this movement that we want to build. You know, we've got to build with organized forces. We can't just be, you know, have ideas. Ideas are of no consequence if they are not rooted in movements. Ideas don't move history forward. It's people that move history forward. So we have to turn to these, you know, platforms, these trade unions of nurses and so on, and let them lead us out of this catastrophe. Let the nurses lead us out of this catastrophe. But we need to be in the battle of ideas. And I think that's what Fatima and I have been engaged in for the last 1.5 hours. I'm very happy to have been with you at the Global Ecosocialist Network. Super to have been with Fatima. I really admire the work you do. Rihad, incredible to be here.
Sorry, Fatima, any last words?
I mean, one final thing, the workers at these drug companies, that's whose support we need, because the workers and their families at Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, I don't think they agree with their bosses, and they don't want to see a system of suffering and profiteering, you know, at the expense of people. And so we need them to speak up, and we need them to join us, because, you know, workers are going to have to lead the struggle to make sure that healthcare does not continue to be privatized. Because if we lose the wave of momentum, and if we lose all of the arguments we're making in this pandemic, you know, our response to future pandemics from a public health, human rights point of view is basically going to be dead in the water. And that has been the aim, right, with the introduction of TRIPS and forcing countries to be compliant with TRIPS in the last 40 years, it wasn't always that medicines were treated as a commodity. That is something new. And that is what we're going to have to fight against. And yeah, just such an honor to be on this panel with Vijay. And thanks, Rihad and Sabrina.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. Sabrina, Mehmet, maybe Sabrina, you want to say the final few words? My final few words are, it took us many years to build a movement to get access to HIV drugs. In fact, in some instances, we're still fighting to get those drugs into the countries, in the very low income countries that need them. 35 million people have perished from that pandemic. We know up towards 50 to 100 million from the Spanish flu. We are facing another genocide on those terms unless we can get this right. If we cannot get this right, the ability for us to respond to the climate crisis in the manner, in the international manner, with the burden sharing, the collaboration that's required, it doesn't bode well for the future. We've got lots of work to do, comrades. That work has to start tomorrow. We need people's vaccine campaigns in every single country in the global north, particularly in those countries that are producing the vaccine, so we can really put the squeeze on big pharma and on our governments. Thank you ever so much for everybody for today's meeting. Over to you, Sabrina, for the final words.
Thank you, Rihad. I'd like to thank again Vijay Prashad and Fatima Hassan for joining us today. This was a very rich debate. I was typing up lots of notes here as well, and I hope those of you who were following us on YouTube, Facebook, and on Periscope by Twitter could also enjoy this conversation. Please take a moment to follow Vijay, Fatima, Rihad, Global Ecosocialist Network on social media to keep up with the work, keep up with updates regarding this campaign. And I wanted to make a comment, like from my own point of view, like in the case of Brazil, besides this whole mess with vaccination and how it is right now, we do know that some pharmaceutical companies profited a lot, those that are not involved with vaccination, but are involved with medication that's not proper for COVID, but that was really promoted by the government, and the government actually bought a lot of it in really like higher prices than market prices. So we know there's also corruption involved in how these pharmaceutical companies try to take more advantage, or like as Vijay said, right? This is pandemic profiteering, and pandemic profiteering has taken like many different shapes depending where you are. So in a way or another, the fight for a people's vaccine is also a fight against capitalism. Like we need to keep strong on that. Thank you all for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and I hope you can keep in touch.
And thank you for the backroom support, Mehmet, our Turkish compatriot in Ireland.
Yes.
Thank you, comrades. Bye-bye.